Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. This is Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be looking at the Edenton Tea Party. In 1773, specifically December of 1773, there was the famous Boston Tea Party there in Boston, Massachusetts. The Edenton Tea Party was a very different type of tea party, but was still a tea party against the importation of British goods. And it occurred right here in North Carolina. And Chris, what I found fascinating about the Edenton Tea Party is that even though it happened in 1774, several months to a year after the 1773 Boston Tea Party, nobody really knew anything about this particular tea party till 1827.
No, and I think we could call it, whereas the Boston Tea Party was this just like really crazy event that happened. This one you could call a very polite tea party, because whereas the Boston Tea Party, I mean, they throw the tea overboard. This one, they simply, well, not simply, but they write a letter. And it's a letter that basically changes the nation. And Ray, this is why it's so important that we study our history, because not only does this take place in North Carolina, but it is a very important part of seeing how revolutionary society was. We hear all the time of Washington and Adams, Jefferson, and all the founding fathers did for, their country. But I guess we need to remember what Abigail Adams said. Remember the ladies. And as we remember the ladies through this podcast, I think our listeners are going to be fascinated to study the powerful influence that 51 ladies had in a small little town, the actual first permanent settlement of the colony of North Carolina, how their writings will stretch all the way across the world and truly change the revolution.
Yeah, and what is so unique about this, and you hinted at it, is that these are women. Women, it's not that they didn't know what was going on. It's not that they didn't have a say through their husbands, through their sons and stuff like that. But this is really unique in that women are taking such a front row seat here to take an action like this, to sign a petition that's going to go before King George III.
I mean, because think through this, when we talk about the Declaration of Independence and those individuals who signed their name, when we're talking in our classes about this monumental moment, they're signing away their life. Basically, it's basically a death sentence when you put your name on something. There is no doubt that up and down the 13 colonies, that there were conversations happening in the tavern, conversations happening in the homes. People were talking about how upset they were with the British and with the events that are going on. But for you to say it, but act upon it, was something totally different, because it's not like the British were just way on the other side of the Atlantic. The British were here, whether it was in the form of tax collectors, whether it was in the form of a provincial governor. I mean, even now, and we're talking about Edenton, North Carolina, which is, northeast North Carolina, right? And it's a small little town. During this time period, Ray, I believe that there were about 600 individuals living in the town. So for 600 people living in Edenton, they do something that is just as impressive what the 57 people did up there in Philadelphia with a constitutional convention, or with the Continental Congress, right? Wouldn't you agree that here you have these women who are basically trying to set an example for all colonists? Here's how you respond. Here's how you move about.
Yeah, and it absolutely, they were not going to be silent, as we're going to see when we look at their petition. They were not going to be silent in the face of what they saw was British injustice against the American colonies. And going back to what you said, in research for this particular episode, I looked at an account in which it was discussing how a lot of women during this particular time were, they wanted their tea. They wanted their British goods. And we know George Washington, one of the things that aggravated him was, not getting the goods he had purchased when purchased them from England, and they wanted those things. So for these women to, be willing to sign this non-importation petition, in which they're not going to be importing British tea, etc., that's a pretty good sign of their determination to support the cause of independence at this particular time. Now, they are following in the footsteps in some ways of the North Carolina legislature, which in 1774 passed a non-importation agreement, which of course is just saying we're not going to bring in British goods, whether it be tea or glass or clothing or whatever the case may be. We're not going to bring those things into the colonies. And that sort of, I guess, between the Boston Tea Party and that event, that sort of led the women to take this step. Whether the step was thoroughly planned out or not, that was what caused these women to actually, specifically one woman by the name of Penelope Barker, this is what moved her and her friends to create this petition, sign this petition, and send it forward.
And to go back, let's be honest, yes, the women might not have had a major voice in politics. They might have had the connotation of staying at home and being, working out of the home. But these ladies, especially these ladies who are in Edenton, which, when we think about Edenton, it was originally called Queen Anne's Town. When we think of these ladies, they're very intelligent, very educated. It said about Barker, that she was Penelope, that she was known as being very handsome, which was the term that they used for beautiful during that time, but that she had intelligent eyes, and she had this powerful energy, brilliant conversationalist, a society leader. These are attributes that are given to her. And one other basically said that she is one of those high-born women fitted by nature to lead, that fear formed no part of her composition. Her face bears the expression of sternness without harshness, which a cheap novelist would describe as hauteur. So in other words, here's a woman who, don't mess with her, right? And I mean, she is ready to go. And you might know not to mess with her because she's on husband number 3 when this is being written. So she knew what was going on, and she had a very specific way of what to do and how to do it.
Yeah, and her husband was none other than Thomas Barker, who was the treasurer of the province of North Carolina at this time. So she's married to an important guy, and here she is, following in his footsteps, I guess, to some degree, on October 25, 1774, putting together this Tea Party. And Chris, what I found interesting was, when we think of the Boston Tea Party, you think about members of the Sons of Liberty boarding these ships, dressed up as Indians, throwing these boxes of tea into the Boston Harbor. We didn't, even though this is called the Edenton Tea Party, there was no tea party, as it were. These women, it was like a social club, and they drank tea and things like that. And, I was looking through the sources, and I'm not really sure if there was ever really even a gathering of these women, or if Penelope just had her friends, 51 of them, or 50 of them, whatever the case may be, sign this petition, basically saying, we're not going to buy British tea, we're not going to buy British clothing, we're not going to buy anything British until the British, recognize our independence.
Well, yeah, let's kind of go back, and I guess we can go all the way back to like the Renaissance period, when all of the thinkers would gather together in salons, right? And that's where they would discuss philosophy and all of the questions of what is life and all of that. Well, ladies soon picked up that, where you might have John Locke and other individuals kind of gathered in one room, the ladies would gather in a room. And they would discuss some of the very same issues that their husbands or the men were discussing in the other room, and they would have their ideas. You mentioned Penelope, her husband was very well known. He was very involved. They talked at home. She knew what was going on. She understood the British. She knew what was happening. And so she would get together with their ladies, and they would have tea parties. And I guess it follows the English tradition of what do they call it? High tea, I think, or noon tea, and where they would get together. And the Queen still does this today, where she gets together and she has tea with individuals. And when you have tea, you discuss, and you have it's these intimate gatherings. Maybe some people would equate it today. It's kind of like what you do at a beauty shop or a barber shop when people get together and they have conversations, and they talk about what's going on, right? I mean, they have the conversation. So they gather in the home. Now, I do think what is interesting is that this Edenton Tea Party, that, yes, they had tea parties, but never did they have tea parties of 50 people.
No.
So this was new. This was different. And also, she had organized it, told them they were going to have a tea party, and invited them. And when they got there, they enjoyed the tea. And then she said, oh, by the way, I need you to sign something.
That's right.
So it's not like they got together and came up with this document. Now, I could be wrong in this, but my research and my understanding is she created the letter.
Yeah.
She had all of the things in place. All she had to do was to convince the other ones to put their name to it, which is not an easy feat.
No. And I want to give our listeners a little bit of a taste of what this petition sounded like, because this was not a weak petition. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, obviously, but it says, quote, "The providential deputies of North Carolina, having resolved not to drink any more tea, nor wear any more British clothes, etc., many ladies of this province have determined to give a memorial proof of their patriotism, and have accordingly entered into the following honorable and spirited association. I send it to you to show your fair countrywomen how zealously and faithfully American ladies follow the laudable example of their husbands, and what opposition your ministers may expect to receive from people thus firmly united against them," end quote. So in other words, look what our husbands did, the non-importation treaty, the non-importation agreement. We're following in their footsteps. We're doing that. And we're going to put our names on here. And, there's a list of 51 names here, not just simply Penelope Barker, but Mary Blount, Elizabeth Creasy, Margaret Cathcart, Elizabeth Patterson, Sarah Beasley, Mary Jones, Sarah Valentine, Annabelle Hornblow. I mean, we got 51 names that were put on this petition that was sent attention to George III.
There's an interesting letter that was written. It was written, I think it was in 1775, January 31st. And it is being written by a man whose name is Arthur Iredale. He was living in England during the time. And what's interesting about him is his brother is James, who would later become an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And what's happening is there's this letter that's being written by Arthur Iredale to another guy whose name is Johnston. And why does that matter? It's because it's one of the wives of he's one of the husbands of one of the signers, I think. But anyway, the letter states something and basically says, I've heard about what is going on with these Edenton ladies. And, he says, is there a female Congress in Edenton too? I hope not, for we Englishmen are afraid of a male Congress. But if the ladies who have since the Amazonian Arab been esteemed the most formidable enemies, if they should attack us, basically he's saying we're in trouble. And his last words in that letter, I think, says a lot. He says, I can perceive It is the probability that there are but few places in America which possess so much female artillery as Edenton. So here's little tiny Edenton of 600 people, and you got 50 ladies that have signed their name to a document. And Ray, you mentioned something in that document. This is not just about drinking tea. It's also about not buying the linen, the wool, all of that clothes. So what they're doing now is saying, we're pledging extra work on ourselves. We're not just going to sit up in some hot, stuffy corridor and just talk about how upset we are. We might not be able to pick up a gun and go fight, but you know what we can do? We can sit there and say, we're going to make freedom clothes. We're going to make liberty clothes. We're going to take the scraps that we have and we'll make our clothes. We're not going to buy anymore for English. And Ray, you know, look at today's war in Ukraine that we're talking about. What is the tool that these Western countries are trying to use to stop a formidable foe such as Russia? It's not necessarily the going in and fighting, is it? They're using sanctions. They're using things to stop trade, to stop the supply of things. History does repeat itself, right? Because that's what was happening here. They were using the prohibition, the boycotting of goods to try to send a message to England like, you can't win against us. And it's the same thing happening here. So I think it's interesting, the correlations that work. And, you know, you see the Ukrainians rise up against the formidable foe. And here we have the remember the ladies who are not well known, who are not popular, but who are rising up against this formidable foe and basically saying, throw us whatever you got, but we'll win. We'll be victorious. And Ray, they catch a lot of flack for it. And I mean, they're pretty much put through the mud in the ringer, if you will.
Yeah, there were cartoonists and others in England that really paint them in very, very unflatterable light. But you go back to the Ukrainian situation, and I think Russia, you know, maybe should look at the American Revolution and how the British struggled to maintain control. You know, to win a location. Let's just say, for example, Philadelphia. You know, they took Philadelphia. And then they had to move out of Philadelphia because, you know, holding these towns just was very difficult for the British to do. And it's going to be, I think, very difficult for the Russians to gain and hold territory when you've got almost an entire population against them. Now, in the American Revolution, the British did have loyalists who would help them, but I don't think the loyalists turned out in the numbers that the British had thought and hoped they would. And they ended up fighting an armed and patriotic population. You think about Lexington and Concord, and how the British, you know, they weren't fighting Washington's army or anything like that. They were fighting regular citizens that had taken their muskets and were out there protecting their town. And I think history shows us that it's very hard, even for an army like Russia, to hold on to territory and to win a fight when you're fighting an armed and patriotic population.
So let's ask the hard question, because we've kind of the letter they get raked over the coals. The picture is, I mean, I encourage our listeners to find Edenton Tea Party image, and it will show, I mean, it's got a dog urinating on them. Their faces are very disfigured. I mean, they are made to be very, very grotesque, if you will. But, you know, even the sacrifice made, like, her husband was actually over in England when this letter comes out. And I don't remember the amount of time, but I want to say that it's 3 years that she'll see her husband again, because she sent out this letter. We're talking about Penelope, that it's like 3 years before she sees her husband again, because he had to go in hiding because of this, right? And my question to you, and I'm going to ask you before you ask me, my question is, why do we spend so much time talking about a group of men who dressed up trying to hide themselves going against the British, and very little time talking about ladies who are willing to sign their name on a dotted line and were willing to sacrifice who they are and their lives? What's missing when it comes to history? Why do we focus on the Boston Tea Party and we don't focus on the Edenton Tea Party?
I think there are two explanations for that. Number one, The Boston Tea Party, let's just be honest, is more sexy. I mean, you've got people dressed up as Indians boarding boats. You've got them throwing this tea into the Boston Harbor. It's very dramatic. It's very climactic almost. And then you have this group of ladies down in a small town in colonial North Carolina. Like you said, about 600 residents in this town signing a petition, and like I said earlier, this is my second thing I would say in response to that, is that this particular event really wasn't known about until so some of the paperwork was discovered in 1827. So I think that also plays a role in it. But the fact that it wasn't as loud, it wasn't as rambunctious, but also it wasn't known for a long time was why maybe we didn't know so much about it. Do you think maybe the fact that it was women also played a role in why we don't know as much about it?
I think that's the biggest reason. And what saddens me is that with all of the resources that we have in today's society, with all of these things that, the books, and you and I know firsthand, because we do a lot of research, and we are blessed that we can easily go into archives, and we can go to the National Archives, the actual National Archives in Washington, D.C., and we can pull up original stuff through where we are here in Bladen County. And so the resources are out there, but we don't spend enough time really focusing on that. Because I think you are right. It is sexy. And this isn't well known because it's not Boston, it's Edenton. Mm-hmm. It's North Carolina, which, by the way, North Carolina doesn't have a really good track record during the American Revolution time period. It doesn't have the same gung-ho. Think about Boston and Massachusetts and New York and Philadelphia. The American Revolution right there, that's the heartbeat of everything going on, right? And in North Carolina, you have a lot of loyalists. You got a lot of people that are kind of like, well, I really don't want to fight the British because, they're big, bad, mean people, and I just want to stay away from them. And we're just happy in North Carolina, and let's just. So it doesn't get publicized as much. But there's no sense that it's not publicized now. There's no sense that in today's society, we don't highlight these women and their efforts, because I still go back to the fact they didn't dress up. They didn't hide. They signed their name. And especially Penelope, my gracious, who's the one that said, I'm going to do something about it. I think it does speak to the importance of all of us recognizing that our voice does matter. And whether you're in Bladen County or you're in Chicago, Illinois, or wherever you are, your voice matters. And if you believe that there is something that is wrong, you need to work to make it right. So there's a message of hope here. There's a message of solidarity. There's a message of strength. And it's history you didn't know but should, because this is how you make change. You make change by saying, I might be in lowly Edenton, but you know what? I can make a difference. And the more we hear about these stories and the more we talk about these stories, maybe the more motivation we'll have to rise up and to stand up and to try to make a difference for those things that are needing to be changed. I don't know if that makes sense. That's just kind of my thought process on this.
It does. It makes very, very good sense. And I was thinking as you talked about, lowly Edenton and North Carolina and all that, how an important role North Carolina played in so many events in the American Revolution. Guilford County Courthouse during the American Revolution. But going back earlier in that, and we talked about this in an episode we did very early on Morse Creek. You got the Battle of Morse Creek, which was very influential in North Carolina declaring independence. And we of course talked about that. But then, jump forward to the Civil War, and you got Fort Fisher, and Dr. Chris Fonville, retired professor of history at UNC Wilmington, has done a great job of sort of bringing to light many of the things that, or many of the things done at Fort Fisher, but also the importance of Fort Fisher to the Confederacy and to the Union, obviously for different reasons. But, North Carolina did play a more important role in a lot of American history than I think sometimes people give it credit for. And the Edenton Tea Party is just another example of North Carolina having an important role in American history.
Yeah, and also having not as a positive role in American history. Go back to, here's maybe some future podcast topics we talk about that, when the very time came to elect the first president of the United States.
Yeah.
North Carolina didn't vote.
Nope.
I mean, when it came to time to talking about ratifying the Constitution, North Carolina's not number 1, number 2, number 3. Shoot, they're not number 10. They're not number 11. I mean, so there's things that our state, and I know that we have listeners all around the world, but if you think about this, the state of North Carolina has had such a direct impact on the history of America, for good and for bad. And that's why it's important that we understand all scenarios, because you can't really understand the tapestry of America without understanding the differences of things and how they happen. As you and I have said numerous times, when we walk into our classroom, our goal every day is to make sure that our students understand you're going to learn the good, the bad, and the ugly of history. And this is actually really, really good. The ugly part is not too many people know about it. And so you and I, through this podcast, we hope that you will go out there and tell people about the Edenton Tea Party. And Ray, it's been a long time since I've been to Edenton, but if I'm not mistaken, there is I think it's a cannon with a teapot on it, if I'm not mistaken, right? And I think it's still there. You're nodding your head on it. So
I don't know if it's still there.
Right?
Yeah.
But it was, right?
Yeah.
And it's that symbol, right? So, I mean, as you're traveling about, Edenton's a beautiful place to visit. And so, when you're there, ask them about the Edenton Ladies Tea Party. I think the house also is still around that famous historic district too, where you can kind of walk in the footsteps of history.
There you go. Find history in your own backyard. Well, Chris, like you said, I hope our listeners will share this podcast with their family and friends. You can find us on Sounder FM. You can find us on Spotify, Facebook, Twitter. We're all over the place. So feel free to share this podcast, this episode, with your family and friends. Always feel free to leave us a comment on Facebook or Twitter. You can send us an email at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know, @gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.